All right, well, we've had an hour on mediation rules, an hour on mediators' duties, and now an hour on the power of connection. Which one of these doesn't fit? I'm going to hazard a guess that when I say mediation, the first thing that pops into your head isn't connection. Steve and I, though, we think about connection between human beings who are in conflict a lot. Years ago, and now it's been more than 20 for me, I shifted from doing superior court and workers' comp mediations to doing collaborative mediations and collaborative law. And for me, that was an intentional shift away from facilitating money negotiations in favor of attempting to facilitate what are often called interest-based negotiations. I've long been fascinated by the little book Getting to Yes that came out of the Harvard Negotiation Project many years ago now. And in the early 2000s, I wanted to see what putting that negotiation model into practice might look like. So in the process of making that shift to facilitating interest-based negotiations, I began to learn about and understand the power of connection. And in the last 20 years, connection in many different facets has really become central to what I try to do in conflict resolution. And I'm hoping that Steve and I can share a few things with you about human connection that might be helpful to you, whether you're facilitating money negotiations or involved in interest-based negotiations. Steve?
Sort of transition from commercial mediation to interest-based and collaborative models of negotiation was more academic. He was spurred by reading Getting to Yes. I was spurred by frustration. In my life as a mitigator, I really got to the point where I was just pulling my hair out because nobody was talking about what was really going on. Everybody, lawyers, parties, judges, we were all constrained by the rules of procedure to talk about things in terms of causes of action and evidence, likelihood of success on the merits, and so forth. And I'm thinking, well, wait a minute, these two people hate each other. Can we talk about that? Or this person really feels wronged by that person. Can we talk about that? That's really what led me into ultimately the same direction that Mark went into, which is how can we get real with each other? How can we talk about what's really going on? And that was what, 25 years ago or more, almost 30. And I found that it's really a good fit for me, but I also find that it's more effective as a means of helping people not only reach a settlement, but reach a resolution. And we'll talk more about the differences between those. So Tara, can we have the poll question, please?
There you go. Can you all see that? Somebody nod for me.
Yeah, the poll question is, what do you do when people in a mediation start acting irrationally?
All right, people are starting to answer. This is good. We're going to leave it open for about a minute. Read through all of the options. I think E is my favorite, just saying. All right, 20 seconds left, and then I'm going to close the poll. We got a comment that says all of the above. I didn't really list that as an option, but I like that. That's the thinking outside the box. There you go. All right, we've still got answers coming in, so I'm going to leave the poll open just for another few seconds. All right, we're slowing down. I'm going to close the poll, folks. All right, so we have 20 seconds for these to tabulate. As soon as we get those results, we'll post them up for you all to see. And then again, remember at the end of the poll, if you want to X out of it to take it off your screen, just click on that X on the top right of the polling section. Got it. Can you all see those results?
Now, 2 people said yell at them to snap out of it. 25 people said calmly educate them. 10 people said tell them to take a lengthy bathroom break. 113 people said listen attentively to whatever they're upset about. And nobody wanted to pull their hair out in frustration. Actually, was probably would have been my vote. And 65 people didn't answer. I'm a little curious about that. But in any event, I think no matter how frustrating it may be when people get triggered or get difficult, it's hard to know what to do. So all of the above, probably not a bad answer because we've probably all done all of them. But anyway, to my way of thinking, I think that's all normal and really helpful to know, okay, what do I do in the face of high conflict? I want to also read you a quote from one of my favorite North Carolinians, Andy Little. When hostile outbursts occur, it is our job as mediators to help the parties and their advisors move from a state of reactivity to a state of thoughtful decision-making. That's from Making Money Talk. I assume most of you are familiar with. And to me, that helps encapsulate, if not does encapsulate, this idea of the relevance of connection. Because even when we're just talking about the exchange of money, let's say it's a PI case or a wrongful death case, that's enough. I think we can see that even in those cases, people get upset, people get reactive, people can get unreasonable. How do we deal with that? And why would we bother to deal with that? Well, because we want to reach a settlement and hopefully a good one. So that's really what Mark and I are here to talk about is what do you do when people get upset, triggered, hostile, unreasonable, irrational? In fact, I'm also reminded of a quote from Jonathan Swift, some of you may be familiar with. He said, it's hard to reason somebody out of a position they were never reasoned into. And that's where I think we find ourselves. Mark?
Yeah, and we place parties in separate caucus rooms, hoping that will help dampen these strong emotional reactions. The mediator, to a certain extent, controls the communication between the parties. Also can be an effort to dampen the emotional responses. We have attorneys representing the parties in hopes that will help dampen the emotional responses. The problem is emotional responses are just part of conflict and disputes, right? I mean, we've all been in an argument ourselves, at which time we had a strong emotional response. It happens. And what Steve and I are going to suggest is that connection is a powerful antidote. But before we get into why that might be, let's talk about why people in conflict have strong emotional responses. And the primary reason is because there's a curious thing about our brains. They don't really distinguish very well between a significant threat to our actual survival and a psychic threat to our sense of dignity or self-worth or ego. And neuroscientists can show you now with brain mapping how the same lights that go on in the limbic system when you're threatened, your very survival is threatened, those same lights come on when you perceive a threat to your sense of self-worth or your sense of self. The number one threat to sense of self is a moral judgment. You're a bad person, you're at fault, you're wrong. The cousins to moral judgments are criticism, comparisons, you're not as smart as she is, diagnoses, you're crazy, you're an idiot. Cousins to those cousins are being excluded, not being given the benefit of the doubt, not being listened to. And guess what's happening in most mediations? A bunch of these things. And so strong emotional responses are very predictable. And the question becomes, beyond a caucus beyond controlling the communication between the parties, how do you as the mediator best respond to these strong emotional and predictable responses that happen in conflict?
So Mark's talked about the why. I'd like to talk about the who for a moment. Who gets emotional in mediation? All of the above. We all do. Mediators, claims reps, lawyers, parties. You've all seen that. Why might that be? I think Mark's already hinted at it. It has to do with our biology, but it also has to do with our psychology. Mark was talking about threats to our ego, threats to our dignity, our self-image. All of that I might subsume under the category of threats to our identity. Every one of us has a sense of who we are. This is who I stand for this. I believe in this. I'm a good person. I'm a moral person. Stand up for the weak. Whatever it might be, we all have an identity. And we cling to it because identity ultimately is a colossal defense mechanism against the forces of the id, the unconscious, if you look at it from a Freudian lens. And people are willing to die for their identity. We see that every day in the newspaper. So identity is a nice way to think about why people are getting triggered, what's going on. And since we all have identities, each one of us is susceptible to this. All right, so what does it mean? Here's the what question. What does it mean when we get triggered? What's actually happening, and how can we tell that it's happening? So as Mark said, it's a threat. We perceive some kind of a threat to our dignity, our self-worth, our sense of who we are, and we take it as though it were a threat to our very lives, and we respond accordingly. Those same mechanisms in the limbic system, in the amygdala in particular, get activated. In fact, over here, I don't know if it's made its way to North Carolina, but in California, we're fond of talking about amygdala hijack. That's just shorthand for emotional reactivity. Sometimes it's incredibly obvious, right? People start pounding their fists on the table, they stand up, they threaten to walk out, whatever it might be. They yell, curse, cry. Those are the obvious ones. People are having emotional reactions all the time. I remember a study that I read a long, long time ago, and it was of, I think it was teenagers and maybe men and women in their 20s, and they hooked up these folks in a movie theater. They're all watching a movie in this theater, but they're all hooked up to these various sensors. And what they noticed is that the women in the audience tended to very overtly show what their emotional reaction was to whatever was on the screen at the moment, whereas the guys were typically pretty stoic. But when they actually looked at their physiological reactions, they were identical. So the men apparently felt it was somehow contrary to their sense of who they were to actually display their emotions. Somehow that would be unmanly or something like this. I guess that might be a rather traditional and disfavored way of looking at it. But anyway, that's an old study. But the point I'm making simply is reactions can be happening and can be very subtle. So what might they look like when they're subtle? People might say no when you think it actually would be in their interest to say yes, or they're constantly changing their reasons for saying no. You start scratching your head, what's going on here? This isn't quite adding up. So that sense of confusion that you as the mediator might be feeling could be an indication that there's something going on, and confusion can trigger people. Imagine you're an attorney and you're in a mediation and you're advocating for your client, and suddenly you feel confused. That might feel scary, might feel unprofessional. Got to cover that up. And you, as the mediator, might be picking up on that. You might feel confused. That means something's getting triggered in the room. It's not just you. My encouragement is always don't take your emotional reactions as the mediator at face value. It usually means something's going on in other people in the room as well. And that's worth investigating. Other signs of sort of subtle reactivity, people suddenly tightening up or armoring up. They cross their arms, they cross their legs, they look away, they no longer make eye contact, change their tone of voice. People might be tearing up, Lots of different things I could say about body language, but pay attention to it because they tell you a lot. They say most of communication, 80% of communication is nonverbal, and a lot of that is through body language. So these are all ways of sensing when reactivity might be present in the room. But again, it might be so subtle, you might not really see anything with your eyes. That's why I'm asking you to use your own feelings as a barometer of what might be happening in the room. The other important point here is what actually happens when an amygdala hijack takes place. Physiologically, what happens? A lot of different things depending on whether they're going in the direction of fight, flight, or freeze. Because really that's what we're talking about. It's a threat. And people unconsciously are either girding for battle or running away or just crawling into their turtle shell. But one of the things that happens physiologically is literally when people are, let's say, out on the savannah and they hear a roar, what happens? We get very alert, we stop thinking, we start scanning, and actually also what happens is blood literally runs to the extremities. We stop digesting food. In fact, there's usually an explosive release of waste products. That's where the expression scared shitless comes from, and pissed off. And that's so that we can use our limbs and our bodies to run or fight. Another thing that happens is there is a physiological and a neurological disconnection between, let's just say, the prefrontal cortex. That's right up here, and that's the part of the neocortex that we use for our executive functioning. So there's a disconnect between that and the other areas of the brain. And that's why people say stress makes you stupid, because that's literally true. And that's why it's impossible to reason someone out of a position they were never reasoned into, because they don't have access to their reasoning capacity. And that's why it's pointless to try to educate people or talk them out of their reactivity, or otherwise try and deal with reason with somebody who no longer has access to reason. And this is where the power of connection comes in.
So to make this a little more concrete, let's use a hypothetical. Let's say for a moment that you're mediating a medical malpractice wrongful death case. And the negotiations were making progress, but then they get bogged down. It's becoming clear that the plaintiff, decedent's wife, is insisting on damages that far exceed any potential damages she could get at trial. She wants punitive damages, even though there hasn't been, there's just no evidence of willful and wanton conduct. Whenever you're in the room with the widow, she has her arms crossed, her lips are stretched tight. She's typically looking away from whoever is talking at the moment. What do you do? I think, and I may be mistaken based on the polling answers, but I would have thought that at least my first instinct is to want to make sure that the widow understands the legal standard. She's just not going to get punitive damages. And so I would probably have a sidebar with the widow's attorney and say, I'm wondering if you understand, I wonder if you understand that punitive damages aren't an option in this case. And then the widow's attorney would say to me, of course I know that, but she won't listen to me. I'm here because I'm hoping she'll listen to you, right? And so there you are, sucked into trying to reason the widow out of a position that she was never reasoned into. Now let's, Steve, you want to pick it back up?
Sure. So with that hypothetical in mind, let's talk about what are some of the different things we could do. We've already talked about trying to reason with somebody who no longer has the capacity to reason. There's another option, and this is where connection comes in. But what does that actually look like? First thing that I think is important to understand about connection is this. The language of connection is different from the language of problem solving. Most of the time, we're in problem-solving mode for a variety of reasons. One, that's how we're trained, and two, that's the parties and the lawyer's expectation, but also three, because we're here to solve a problem. That's why people hired us as mediators. They have a problem, they want it solved. And that's fine. But if all we do is problem solve, then we'll probably find ourselves trying to reason or educate with somebody who is in the midst of an amygdala hijack and you can't get through to them. And so there's an alternative. The alternative is connection. What does that mean exactly? I'll say something about that in a moment. I have more than just one thing to say about it, but what I want to say right now is that we have to shift gears within ourselves in order to even enter into the territory of connection. If you try to connect from a place of being rational, it won't work. If you try to connect from a place of problem solving, people will sense the lack of your emotional presence. They might feel it as a lack of sincerity. They might feel it as, you don't really understand me. You have your agenda. So the first thing we have to do is we've got to step out of the problem solving mindset and enter into a different part of our intelligence. And it is universal. We all have this human capacity to connect. And when people are in the midst of an emotional hijack, it is an encoded message: help, help, I'm feeling alone. I'm feeling scared. My feelings are overwhelming me. I'm confused. I don't know what to do. That's why if we respond with trying to educate them, to get them to get it, not only are we going to get nowhere, we're probably going to make the situation worse because these people are perhaps unconsciously pleading for help and we're not giving it to them. So we have to make this shift. But what is the shift? What does it actually look like? First thing I would say is it's kind of like the language of the heart versus the language of the head. We talk about mediating in the shadow of the law or bargaining in the shadow of the law. Now we have to bargain in the shadow of the heart. And we all, it's a wide spectrum, it's a huge bell curve, but we all know something about this. We all know something about being human. We have relationships in our lives, people we love, people who we connect with. We need to start drawing upon that part of our experience. So, really, really important to get these folks to understand that you're with them, that you have made this switch because you've noticed that they're in need of some kind. A little aphorism I came up with for this is as follows: when working the legal case, the point is to make an agreement. But when working the emotional case, as Mark and I call it, the point is to make a connection. So when we make this switch, our goal has changed. And if we don't let go of that agenda, that outcome, all right, let me just help you calm down so we can get back to the real business. People will smell a rat. That's why I'm saying we have to basically completely change our outlook, our mindset, even the language we use. The point is no longer to reach an agreement. We're just putting that on hold. The point is to make a connection. Here's an example that isn't exactly from a PI case. It's a story that my wife told me recently. My wife is a parenting coach, parenting consultant. She works with parents who are having difficulty figuring out, how do I deal with my 16-year-old, or how do I deal with my child who's throwing tantrums? Well, apparently she had a couple who came to see her just a few weeks ago, and their child was throwing tantrums, and they just didn't know what to do, and they tried timeouts, and they tried everything that the book said, count to 3 or whatever it might be. And what she told them was, why don't you try just staying with your child and just reflecting back, I know you're having a hard time right now. I really see that. And so they went and they tried that. It's actually, there's a term for it in her kind of work. They call it stay listening. So they tried that, and the kid just eventually ran out of steam and then kind of melted because people weren't trying to change him. They weren't trying to say, no, 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 snap out of it, which is what we're often doing. Instead, they stayed with this child where he or she was, and apparently for the whole rest of the day, this little kid just wanted to snuggle with the parents, and it had a complete transformation. All of that was due to the power of connection. That's really all I think my wife was teaching. It's not really all that different. And we've seen people actually throw tantrums. And as most of you voted on the poll, sometimes we have to just listen to what they're upset about. So how do you do this? Oh, it's easy for you, Solmeyer. You're a psychologist. Yeah, that's true. I have an advantage, but again, these are human skills, and we all have them to whatever degree. So a couple of things that might help. One is learn about something called nonviolent communication. You've got a great resource in North Carolina with Mark Springfield, who's very well trained in this and very familiar with it and uses it all the time in his work. But be that as it may, get Marshall Rosenberg's book called Nonviolent Communication. And it's really all about how to listen for what people are really needing, even if they're not coming right out and saying, here's what I need. Most of the time, they don't come right out and say it. So these are different strategies offered by Dr. Rosenberg about how to practice empathy. And the main thing about empathy is you've got to be sincere, you've got to care, you've got to be present. You've got to really listen. You have to set aside your own agenda, and people have to feel your caring, feel your presence, feel your attention. If you do empathy, again, with an agenda of, come on, let's get over this, let's get to the real reason why we're here, that's not empathy. And people are going to let you know that, and there's probably a price to pay for that. So really important to brush up on our empathy skills. There's different kinds of empathy. We need to learn what they are, how to use them, when to use them. All this is covered in Marshall's book, and we could talk more about it, but we've got a few other things to talk about. The other thing I want to say is, and this really comes from Mark, is when people get emotionally triggered, it's not just a shift in our sort of neuronal structure in our brain. Our bodies are flushed with all kinds of chemicals, hormones, and neurotransmitters and such. And that's part of what's bringing about the fight or flight response. What brings about the fight or flight response physiologically is something called the sympathetic nervous system. And what snaps us out of that fight or flight is something called the parasympathetic nervous system, which floods our body with calming chemicals. Calming chemicals allow us to settle down, just like you might think. So part of what we're doing when we look through a physiological lens is we're trying to help people activate their parasympathetic nervous system and flood their bodies with those calming chemicals. How do you do that? There's lots of different ways. Empathy and connection is the one we're focusing on here today, but there are other ways. But the bottom line is it takes a little bit of time. Mark tells me it takes about 20 minutes to get the activating chemicals out of our system. And I think that's probably right. So we need to take a little bit of time and not be looking at our watches. Mark, what about your hypothetical? How might that relate?
All right, so back to our widow and her medical malpractice claim. She's dug in on settlement, a demand that's higher than even her own attorney is saying she can get in court. What do you do as the mediator? So we've observed that, she's not making eye contact. She's got her arm crossed. I'm thinking something's got her emotionally triggered. And so I want to see if we can make some progress towards settlement by coming at it from the perspective of connection. That means I want to see if I can understand what she's experiencing, what she's feeling, what her core needs are that are giving rise to those feelings. Basically, empathy. Now, I'm assuming for purposes of our hypothetical that I've already had an opportunity to say hello to the plaintiff, and that I've had a chance to demonstrate to her that I care about her situation, that I respect what she's going through. I may even have asked me to tell her a little about her late husband, or to tell me what it's been like to lose her husband, or what the journey through the legal system has been for her. And I want to make an aside here and say that there was a time when I would have been kind of concerned about showing this level of interest in a party. I would have been worried about the appearance of impartiality. I think we've gotten from our legal system the idea that to be impartial means to be equally unconcerned about both parties to a dispute. It was really liberating for me to hear somebody say and point out that in mediation, you can be impartial as long as you're equally concerned about both parties. And so I give myself the permission to be concerned equally about both parties. Now, you have to, in order to maintain the appearance of impartiality, you do have to be equally concerned about both parties. But back to the hypothetical. I've decided that it may be important to make connection with the widow. To do that, I would first silently explore, based on everything I've observed up to that point, what I think might be going on for the widow. Then I would ask questions to see if what I think she's experiencing is close to what she's actually experiencing. So I might ask her, I'm wondering if when you look at this latest proposal from the hospital, if you're feeling upset because you need for the people at the hospital to understand how painful this has been for you, and this settlement offer doesn't do that. And I can imagine her saying back to me, no, that's not really it. You're right, it has been really painful, but mainly the hospital needs to be taught a lesson. Now I have more information about what she's feeling and the core needs that are at play. And so I might say, are you worried that the hospital hasn't learned from your experience? And do you want to make sure that someone else doesn't have to go through this? Is that closer? And to this question, I might get an emphatic yes. And she makes eye contact with me for the first time. I hold that eye contact for a moment to show her my respectful understanding of what she's experiencing. And here's another aside. It's important to me to make a connection by showing that I have a respectful understanding of what the other person's experiencing. It does not mean that I agree with what the other person is experiencing. It's just a respectful understanding that we're after. And if other parties or their attorneys are present when I'm attempting to have this respectful understanding, I may need to explain at some point what I'm doing, because to someone else it may look like I'm agreeing, but it's not agreement, it's respectful understanding. If you're caucused, it doesn't really matter, nobody's watching. But if you're not caucused and you're trying to make this connection by having a respectful understanding, I often explain what I'm doing so that nobody gets the idea that I've lost my impartiality. So let me pause the hypothetical at that point and turn it back to Steve.
Thanks, Mark. So Mark was talking about the shift that he observed in this hypothetical, and I imagine it's based on a real case, which is what happened when he gave an interpretation, essentially. So are you saying this? And no, it's not really that. It's more this other thing. And one of the things Mark didn't do at that point in the hypothetical was somehow take that as a statement about his intelligence. He didn't take it personally. He took it as negative feedback. That simply means, oh, okay, that's not quite it. Let me see if I can't, given that negative feedback, see if I can't zero in a little bit closer. So that allowed him, by not making it about him, to stay with this woman in this case. And then his next interpretation got an emphatic yes. That emphatic yes is one of the signs that you've made connection. The fact that she made eye contact with Mark for the first time, apparently, that is another indication that connection has been made. What are some other indications that maybe that parasympathetic nervous system is starting to kick in? But whether you look at it physiologically or you look at it relationally, how do you know when you've really made connection? Well, we can look at first of all, the external indicia of that, the body language, for example. You'll see a noticeable relaxation in the person's body. They'll unfold their arms usually. They'll look at you. They might even smile. They might even make an expression of appreciation for the fact that oh, finally, somebody has listened. And in PI cases, by the way, this is so common. Plaintiffs want their day in court, meaning they want somebody to listen with care about what happened to them and the losses that they've suffered, the pain they've been through. And oftentimes, the only time they're going to get it is with you as the mediator. Their own lawyer may not have provided it. A judge got too many cases on her docket. I don't think she's going to get it there. And I think that's one reason why people often decline to settle. I want my day in court. Now, that also may mean I want my pound of flesh. That may be what justice means. But I think that is a false need, covering up something much more vulnerable, a core need that's much more vulnerable and therefore more scary. So, can we provide this day in court? Can we respond meaningfully to this need that we all have to be recognized as human beings and to show, yes, there's somebody who cares about what you've been through? That can make all the difference in the world and can absolutely shift things. And that's where you start getting the yeses instead of the nos. But you'll also feel it within yourself. Remember, what we can see with our eyes, that's one lens, that's one modality, that's one place we can gather evidence. I can't emphasize strongly enough how important it is to pay attention all the time, to have some percentage of our internal radar on ourselves. 10%, 15%, 20%, whatever it is. But that's partly how we scan what's happening in the room, whether we're in caucus or in joint session. And I have a feeling most of you are in caucus most of the time. There's still emotional things happening. So when you're listening, when you're paying attention, when you're feeling to what's happening within you, you're making connection with you. And that's a big piece of the power of connection. It's not like we are scientists in white lab coats looking through a plate glass window at some scientific experiment. And yet, I have a feeling that we may be perceived like that if we're not really making emotional contact. And that starts with us. Now, there's a principle, and it's not from law. I don't even think it's from psychology. I think it's from music. It's called sympathetic resonance. Sympathetic resonance is what happens when you've got two violins on either side of a big room. You pluck the G string on one violin, and the G string on the other violin way across the room starts vibrating. That's sympathetic resonance. And it's a perfect metaphor for something that human beings have the capacity to do, which is the capacity to start feeling in ourselves something that somebody else in the room is actually feeling. I ask this question a lot when I teach, which is how many people in this room, let's say it's a bunch of mediators, how many people in this room have ever felt incompetent during a mediation? Okay, one brave person might raise their hand, and then people look around, they start raising, soon everybody's raised their hand because we've all felt that way. And what I want to get across is don't take that feeling at face value. If you're feeling incompetent, it usually means somebody else in the room is feeling something like that. It might not be incompetence, but it might be confusion. It might be distress of some kind that they don't know what to do with. And so, okay, great. Well, what do you do with that? Well, it depends on the situation, of course, but one of the things you can do is say, hang on just a second. I'm starting to feel like there's some confusion in the room. I'm starting to feel confused. Is anybody else feeling that way? I've never done this in my practice and not had a positive response. But the key is don't take it at face value. Don't think it's just about you. Because if you feel incompetent and you just take it as about you, what are we going to do? Oh my God, I'm feeling incompetent. I'm the mediator. I'm supposed to know what I'm doing. So what are we going to do? We're going to scramble to feel competent. If we're the lawyer representing a party, well, lawyers aren't supposed to not know what to do. That's a sign of weakness. So we want to look good in front of our clients and so forth. So what do? We start taking remedial action, and that just takes us further away from what's actually happening in the room and what those feelings are trying to communicate to us. So I hope that's clear. We take a look with our eyes, we take a look with our ears, we take a look with our own internal sensations, and we use that to sense what's happening in the room. If we start to relax, That's some indication that, let's just say it's the client we're talking to, the party. Okay, I can feel like that connection is happening. And then we can act on that. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But Mark, back to your hypothetical.
All right, we're going to finish up the hypothetical now. We're at the point where the widow has confirmed that her core need really is for this tragedy just to have some meaning. She wanted the loss of her husband to be a lesson to the hospital so that someone else wouldn't go through what she's experiencing. And when she said yes to my empathic question, all of the things that Steve described happened. She relaxed, and really and truly, when you make one of these connections, it's not unusual to just observe a shift. And it's not any one thing, it's just a cumulative thing, but you can see the shift. All of a sudden, there's better eye contact. I feel that sympathetic resonance, and there's just this shift in energy. So at that point, then, I kind of make a decision. If she's not totally flooded, and this isn't one of those situations where she's jumped up and run out and slammed the door behind her, and it's just clear as a bell that her adrenaline's running, and she's just what we call flooded. If she were flooded, I'd probably want to give, like Steve said, about 20 minutes of additional empathy and quiet time, and let some of those chemicals drain out. But in this situation, once I got a sense that she felt heard and that the sympathetic response had happened, I would be comfortable then beginning to gently affirm that the legal standard in this case doesn't really provide for the remedy that she most wants. Then I would probably move into the pros and cons of settling in this venue versus going through with a jury trial. I would feel comfortable that I could start to reason with her about whether she wanted to seriously consider getting to a settlement in the mediation rather than going forward.
So I'd like to share maybe a couple of other ways of looking at the power of connection. Here we're talking about a bereaved widow, and a lot of you may be thinking, okay, it's one thing when you have a bereaved widow or you have a plaintiff that's been seriously injured, and of course there's going to be some kind of an emotional response to that. But what happens if the person that's getting triggered is some hard-assed business person, or it's the lawyer who's gotten really angry and explosive? I don't know that just listening and saying, oh, wow, you seem so upset. A lot of us are just going to laugh at that idea. So how do we handle an amygdala hijack when it appears in that form? Rule number one, listen to yourself. Feel what you're feeling. Are you feeling scared on the other end of that level of vitriol or that level of anger, for example? That's important to know. Again, it's not just about you. It's also telling you something about what might be going on with the other people in the room, including the person who's getting angry. Anger is famous among psychologists as being a covering emotion. I don't think we need to be psychologists to recognize that. We'd rather feel empowered, and anger can make us feel bigger, make us feel stronger than feel the fear or the sadness or the insecurity or the confusion or whatever else might be there that we don't want to feel. So if the emotional reaction that is difficult is something like anger or a threat to walk out or whatever, it doesn't mean you have to be like a really bad example of a syrupy therapist. So here's some ideas of what you might do. I actually used this yesterday. I was in a mediation, I was telling Mark, I was in a mediation till 10 p.m. last night, and there was a lot of emotions and people threatened to leave. And one of the things I said was, staying as calm and centered as I could. Okay, walking out is certainly one option that you have. What other options do you have that might serve your interests? It's just it's kind of one of those just jarring things. It's like tilting for those of you who are old enough to remember pinball machines, when we used to try to tilt it a little bit to get the ball to go where we wanted, but if you do it a little too much, everything freezes. There are questions you can ask like that that accomplish the same thing. When you don't react in the sort of common habitual way, oh my God, you're so scary, or you respond with an equal amount of anger, if you just kind of stay calm and say, okay, yeah, that's an option available to you. Are there any other options that might meet your interests even better? This is what I call taking the temperature down. Here's another hypothetical. You could say something like this. I really get how insulted you are by their latest number. Boy, did I use this one last night. I could communicate your counteroffer to the other side. What effect do you think it would have in the other room? Oh, I hadn't really thought about that. Well, I just want them to understand their offer's bullshit. Okay. You want me to, basically what you're wanting to communicate to them is your offer is crap. What else do you want to communicate to them? Or stated somewhat differently, what's the message you most want to communicate to the other side? That they've succeeded in getting under your skin and pissing you off? Or that their number's unlikely to get the case settled? And this is what I call using people's, parties, lawyers' natural competitiveness against them. It's a real sort of Aikido kind of a move. Maybe a clear example of this is, I remember I was in a mediation and the lawyers kept interrupting each other with, oh, that's bullshit. That case doesn't say that. What are you talking about? We were in an opening session when this happened. And I said something like, is there a way in which you guys can not allow your opposing number to get under your skin? Oh, I can do that. Well, I can do that. And so now the competition became, okay, how do we get non-reactive? And it was very, very successful. In the other one that I mentioned, all right, I really hear how pissed off you are, how insulting you find their number. Do you really want to communicate an offer or a counter proposal that lets them know they succeeded in getting under your skin? No one is going to say, yeah, that's exactly what I want to communicate. And then they have to self-reflect. Oh, you're right. I did let them get under my skin. What would happen if I didn't let them get under my skin? So there are a lot of different ways to do connection. It's not just putting your arm around the bereaved widow metaphorically. You can talk to the toughest of seasoned business people, lawyers, whatever it might be, and you can make connection in a very, very subtle way, but it really sends a message. You're not intimidated. You're not thrown off your center by their degree of emotionality. And that, in a way, is addressing their plea for help, because it may not look like they're pleading for help, but they are pleading for it. And you're there to answer that call. So I know we got kind of a late start and we don't want to keep you over time. Mark, do you have any concluding comments to make?
No, thank you, Steve. Appreciate working with you as always.
You guys still have about 5 minutes to get going because we started at about 12 or 11:13. So I need you to keep talking to 12:13 so we can get full credit. So you might want to see if there are any questions.
Well, that's exactly what I would suggest. If there are any questions, please unmute yourself. We'd love to hear what they are. This is the problem with going last.
So Steve, I've got a question for you.
Yeah.
Because you're in California, are you finding doing remote mediations because you can work all across the nation to be extremely beneficial? And then how do you get past the difficulty of relating to people very well through remote versus in person?
That's a great question. I suspect you're not the only one who's wondering about that. I certainly prefer in person. I'd say it's just easier to make connection in person, but in a way, Zoom helps us cut through some of the artificiality of distance in terms of time and space, and we can definitely make connection even though we're remote. Right now, I'm doing all my psychotherapy sessions remotely. And I can tell you, in my experience, there's no problem with making equally deep connection remotely that I could make in person. I don't like it as much, but it's definitely doable, and pretty much it's as easily done.
Okay, we do have a couple of questions that have popped up in the chat box. It takes people a while to type. One of the questions we have is, how do you deal with flooding, and how do you determine when people can go on and when to stop for lunch for the day or the day?
So let me make sure I understand the question. I'm not saying I'm going to answer it. Mark may want to answer it, but what do you do when people get flooded was the first part. And then how do you know when you should continue and when you should stop?
Right. I think the question is trying to ask how you gauge your participants when they are flooding with emotion or just overwhelmed, how you know, or what tools you use to call it for lunch and take a short break, or call it for the day, or just try to work them through whatever emotion they're experiencing at that moment.
Yeah, I mean, for me, if I'm in a joint session, then I probably want to break that up because the trigger is probably in the room. And so you need to remove the trigger for a while, long enough for your physiological response to sort of subside. I have heard from a credible source that it does take about 20 minutes for those chemicals to flush once the triggers or the stimulus is sort of removed. If I'm caucused, then I probably would want to stay in the room for 20 minutes before I go to the other room, and just continue to listen and provide empathy. Empathy, like I said at the very beginning, is a very strong antidote for sort of the limbic system response. And so the combination of removing the stimulus, removing the saber-toothed tiger from the path, allowing time for the chemicals to subside, and at the same time indicating that you have a respectful understanding of how scary it was to see the saber-toothed tiger. That combination is what I think brings people back to their frontal lobe and the ability to begin to talk about, what does a reasonable settlement look like in this case.
I would also add to that, just to piggyback, I never end a mediation because people are flooded or because they're pissed off. I try to end mediations when it's pretty clear that their numbers are simply too far apart and that no matter how much longer we go, they're just not going to reach an agreement. The gap is just too big. But that doesn't mean sometimes a lunch break is helpful. As Mark was saying, 20 minutes. Flooded is an appropriate term because they are literally flooded with those chemicals like cortisol and adrenaline and so forth. So a break is often a strategically or tactically good thing to do, but I wouldn't end the mediation because of it.
Okay, I've got one more question that I think we have time for. How do you deal with a party that is resistant or uncomfortable with connection work, where they just want to talk brass tacks?
I think that's a really good question. I think Mark and I probably should both give a response to this. When people are showing resistance to connection, they just want to, well, let's just talk about business. That's a clear sign of resistance. I'm using that in a clinical sense, but I think you get it generically, right? They're obviously defending against something. And it's really, really important to respect people's defenses. Those defenses are there for a reason. I don't know this person. I don't know what early kind of trauma or difficulty or whatever it is they dealt with that would lead them to have that particular kind of a response. But empathy and connection are always the answer. So if they're saying, this is bullshit, I didn't come here for a psychotherapy session, certainly heard that one. That's respond with understanding. I hear you didn't come here for therapy, and actually neither did I. So let's talk about what is possible here for you right now. Mark, where would you go with that one?
Yeah, that's hard. I guess my short response would be to echo Steve and say, pick up a copy of Nonviolent Communication. You can do empathic listening in a way that even the hardest nosed person will appreciate if you do it in a way that's genuine and not in your face. I don't think there's a human being that doesn't appreciate being heard, and so that's my short answer.
You know, speaking of NBC, and this might be a good place to share a wonderful story that Rosenberg shares in his book, Nonviolent Communication. He talks about being on the West Bank, and somebody in the group learns that he's American, and this Palestinian man starts screaming at him. He's enraged at how the Americans are favoring the Israelis over the Palestinians and providing them with all this support. And then he starts going on about, you know, look at where I live. It's all bombed out. I can't even send my child to school. And Rosenberg just stays with him every step of the way. Yeah, he matches his energy. This is called mirroring. He matches his energy. Yeah, you're really pissed at the Americans for their favoritism. It's not fair. It's outrageous. And so on. Who is the author of Nonviolent Communication? Marshall Rosenberg. Anyway, he continued to offer empathy. And it sounds like what you really need is justice. It sounds like what you really want is some fairness. You want to be able to send your child to a good school. You don't want to have to be humiliated on a daily basis. Well, by the end of this exchange, this Palestinian who was ready to basically kill Rosenberg then invited him to dinner with his family. So no matter the level of hostility or tightening up, this is bullshit, empathy and connection are always the answer. And that doesn't mean you're going to get through to everybody, but it's always your go-to option because all the alternatives are worse.